I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts, and welcome back to the Alphabet Soup Sew Along. This video is part 6 of a 9-part series. So if you're jumping in right here, I suggest you sign up at the link below to get all of the information via email and check out the earlier videos, because this one won't make as much sense if you haven't been following along so far. In this video, we're going to talk about spacers. Spacers are basically sashing that go between letters to add readability. Worksheets were sent out to everyone who signed up. Make sure you have those downloaded and handy, as I'm going to be referencing them quite a bit during this video. And these worksheets go over suggestions of when to use them, when not to use them, and what sizes to use. There's unlimited possibilities, and it can be a little intimidating, but I'm here to help you along in your journey. There are rules, and I put it in quotes because there's always a time when the rule can be broken, so forth and so on. But in general, those rules are things like there's never or rarely ever a spacer between an L and a T. The end of the L block and the beginning of the T block, as you can see here in this example, are touching, and there's still quite a bit of space between them and lots of readability. On the other hand, there's always a spacer between an I and an L. If these were together, you would have no space and it would just be a wider L. There would be zero readability. Same thing with an I and an R. There's always got to be a spacer there. Rarely is there ever a spacer between an A and a Y. Again, like the L and T, there is a vertical line here, and that is where the two blocks come together, and there's still a good amount of space. Where it can get a little tricky is things that are less obvious, like a T to an S, an R to a D, a B to an I, a Q to a U. So I have put together over 50 examples of names in these worksheets. In addition to that, in your book, there's also examples of words in the table runner section and in the baby quilt section. So let's jump right on in, and I'm going to go over spacers. Kerning is the technical name for the space between letters or characters. When kerning is good, you don't notice. When it's bad, you do. The goal is not to notice the spacing because your brain just reads the word and doesn't notice the spacing. For example, first page of the worksheets, Henrik. Gonna read it, great, looks good. Your brain sees that word, doesn't notice the spacing because everything's good. Here, your brain sees that something's off. It's hard to read, we're not sure what it says. Then this example, Faith. Again, here we go, good balanced spacing. Here, your brain notices that there's too much space between the F and the A. As I mentioned earlier, there are some rules. So if you go to page 2 of the worksheets, you'll see that I've given you 12 examples of times that you generally will not use a spacer. There are other times that you might not use a spacer, but they're not necessarily rules. For example, I'm not using a spacer here between the E and the W, because there's not a lot of space over here, and there is a good amount of natural space created by this W. So if you're working with a word that is not in the examples, but you have any of these combinations, keep in mind that you most likely will not have a spacer. The next 2 pages go over where you will always need a spacer. These are examples of where readability will disappear without a spacer. So if we went right from an I to an N and pieced those together, you're not going to be able to notice the I. It's just blending right into the N. Other examples would be if I went, so I'm taking the M and the K from my make, and imagine there was no A. If I went right from M to K, you can kind of tell the readability as if it's a logo, but it's difficult. So you always want to have a spacer when your letter ends or begins the block with no background. So a P has lots of background. M and the start of the K do not. There's more instances of where a spacer is needed than not needed. So that's why there are 2 full pages of examples of where a spacer is always needed. After those, I jump right on in to example names. This is how to use these worksheets. Look for the name that you're doing. It might be in here. I took all the suggestions from the Jaybird Quilt Sew Along Facebook group. If your name that you need is not in here, you might find something similar, and that'll give you a jumping off point. Say you want to make a quilt for someone named Julie. You're going to find the name, and then below it you will see the side fillers are the spaces on the right and the left, and then the sashing is the size of the pieces between the letters. The side fillers change based off of the project. The side fillers on here give you a name that's 50.5. As you go on through the worksheets, they get wider, 60, and some of them are even wider for longer names. So keep that in mind if you're making a table runner or something that you don't need to finish at 50. If you have a shorter word like pin, you can have smaller spacers on the sides. Now I'm going to go over the example words I have in front of me and talk about the spacers that I picked and why. First, we'll start with the word pin. So with pin, if we had no spacers, this is what we'd have. A P and then a really fat N. It's not very readable. So we definitely need a space between the I and the N. But the question is, how big of a space? We already have a lot of background space created naturally by the shape of the I. Something to consider is, are you using this as one word in a name quote? In that case, I might just do a narrow spacer here and a slightly wider spacer here and call it a day. Or are you using this word with other words and maybe you want it to take up more space? That was the case here. So I went with a nice wide spacer between the I and the N. This is a 2.5 inch strip. And then I went with a narrower spacer. This is a 2 inch. So this will finish at 1.5. This will finish at 2 over here. So if I overlap the seam allowance, you kind of get an idea of what those will look like. Nice and balanced, easily readable. Now with the word so, if I had no spacers, you can read this word. Sometimes words are completely readable without spacers. Depends on the letters in the word. But I didn't want these pieces to touch these, so I decided, funny, so, S-O-S-E-W, I decided to put a small spacer, a 1.5 inch that'll finish at 1 inch in here between the S and the E. Now, the volume here is a little more balanced with the volume here. This example is the word make. And with this example, you see that there is readability with no spacers, but I still think that small spacers will add to the readability. So in this case, I started with these two. And because I have the same shape here, same large half triangle, and then they're both going into a letter that fills the entire edge, I decided to just put some skinny small spacers there. Just like that. And then when I was playing around with how much I needed here, I realized it's the same 1.5. So sometimes your spacers are the same for the whole word, but not always. And for this example, I have the word cut. Again, you can technically read it with no spacers, but this is blending together. So to add some readability, let's take them apart a little bit. This is another one similar to pin where I know I'm using it in a project that is going to be pretty wide. So I decided to take 2 wide spacers to space this word out. Now, if this was a standalone project, it would work just as well with 2 skinny spacers. So this is why the only hard and fast rules are about where there should always or never be a spacer, but not necessarily what size spacer. Because a U to a T could be a 2.5, could be a 2, could be a 1.5. There's lots of different possibilities. Now say for instance your project is going to utilize different color fabrics for your letters, such as what I did in my cookie cutter banner. Spacers still are important even if the colors of your letters don't directly blend into each other. While I can read that this says must, the readability will be aided by a slight spacer here, here, and possibly none here. Maybe even just a 3/4 inch piece that'll finish at a 1/4 inch just so my points won't touch. There's a lot of negative background space created by the shape of the S and the T. Sometimes with spacers, it's a little bit of trial and error of taking them apart, moving them back and forth. One thing that I'll often do when planning out my spacers is lay out a piece of my background fabric that isn't cut yet and move my letters around. Because sometimes, depending on the color surface you're working on and the color of your letters, it can throw your eyes off. So by having it on top of the background fabric that correctly matches what you're trying to do, you can get a better feel. Another thing that I'll often do is take my cell phone and take a picture. By taking a picture of what I'm doing, I can then look at that picture from a distance and it's much smaller. And when you see things smaller, your eye tends to see what you may not see when you're up close, which in this case for me is I think I need a little bit more space between the U and the S. I'm just going to slide that over. So if you're working on a word where I have not already given you the spacers, so what I do at this point, I measure from the point of the letter to the point of the letter, and in this case it's about a little more than 1 3/4, and then I add 1/2 inch, so that would be 2 1/4. You can cut things to the 1/4 inch, the 1/8 inch, whatever you're most comfortable with to get the spacing that you need for the project that you're working on. I'm going to cover a couple more examples on the background fabric as it really shows how spacers are necessary. So if I was going to take these 3 letters and make the word win, if I had these together, you lose the word. And you see here we have a lot of space, so we need to balance that out. So we're definitely going to put a large space between the I and the N, and we may put just a small space between the W and the I so that this point doesn't directly touch this block. Small space here and a wide space here, and I'll kind of move it back and forth. That's too wide, too narrow, until I think I have a space where the volume here approximately equals the volume over here, because that's when it will feel nice and balanced. If I put them together, you can kind of read it. If they were the same color, you probably could not because there's too much touching each other. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a spacer. And this is a situation where since there's only 2 letters, we're not balancing. So we can go as far apart as we want. If you go too far, they're naturally going to just feel like individual letters. But you can go 1 inch finished, 2 inch finished, 2 1/2, whatever you feel like is the best for your word. One last example, I've got the word T. There is a natural space created by the E and the A, so we don't need to necessarily add space there. We could add a little bit if we wanted to, but I don't think it's necessary. But here we do want some space. Since there already is a good amount of background space, we don't need a large spacer, probably just 1 inch or 1 1/4 finished, so that this volume of this area is approximately equal to the volume of this area. Thanks for joining me here today. I hope you enjoyed this video on spacers and that you now have a better idea of what size spacer to use, when to use them, so that you have readability in your project. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. If you have questions, you can leave those in the comments or over on the Jaybird Quilts Sew Along Facebook group. I'm going to be back here in a couple days to take all of the information we've learned so far, fabric selection, cutting, piecing, and spacers, so we can put all of that together to make the name quilt. I'll see you soon.